Hi everyone, this is Maria Williams. Today I have a fun interactive card using Lone Fun products. I'm going to use the Reveal Wheel dies. I know these are very popular right now. There are a lot of videos out there and they're pretty easy to make. So I'm using the dies, and the dies come with everything you need to do a full reveal wheel card. The standard opening is that arced one, but I'm going to use an option which is that speech bubble opening. It's a separate set of dies that you can purchase. And then I'm going to use the reveal wheel sentiment stamp set. I'm going to use those four sort of rectangular looking ones. They're all birthday related. And then I'm going to use the Critter Concert stamp set. I'm going to do some ink blending for my front panel, so I'm using Bristol Smooth White cardstock, and I was going to use this crumb cake cardstock for my card base, but I changed my mind later on after I had done the inking. But I'm going to show you how I cut the pieces, and then you'll just see that I switched over to navy cardstock. So I'm just taking an 8.5 by 11 sheet of cardstock, and I'm cutting it in half. So one half will be my card base, so it'll be a standard 4.25 by 5.5, and then I'm going to use the remainder of the cardstock to cut some of the pieces for the reveal wheel. So for the reveal wheel, you're going to take the largest of the dies that comes in the set, this rectangular one, and you're going to cut the backer piece without the opening die. So you're just going to take this one rectangular die and you're going to cut one piece. Now this will not be seen, so you could really cut it out of any color cardstock you want. And then out of white cardstock in my case, you're going to cut with the rectangular die, and you're also going to insert whatever opening die you're using. And you can just tape them with a little bit of washi tape so that they don't come apart, and then run it through the Big Shot. Now I decided that I was going to run all the pieces for my reveal wheel through my Big Shot at once. So I'm just placing the circle, small circle, and the scallop circle that are going to be a part of the reveal wheel out of the same piece of cardstock at one time. So now, other than the small arrow that I'm going to cut later to indicate that the wheel needs to be turned, I have all the pieces that I need for my reveal wheel assembly. I decided to use my MISTI to do my stamping. I wanted to do more than one set because I figured I might have some issues with the coloring. So I decided to use this VersaFine Black Onyx ink. It's a fairly new ink to me and I've really enjoyed it. I feel like it stamps really nice, crisp black images. I saw a review where somebody said that it was not a good ink to use with Copics, but I think if you let it dry completely before you start coloring, then you won't have any issues. I've usually used Memento Tuxedo Black ink, and that's a really good ink as well, but I just decided to use this one today. So I placed my images in my MISTI in such a way that I could stamp them twice by just rotating the piece of cardstock, and then I'm going to use Copic markers to color in all the images. I started the coloring with the raccoon. I thought it would be the easiest one for some reason, and I used C3, C5, and C7, and I believe I originally used E00 to paint to color in the flute, but it was too light, so I think in the end I used E33. I used C3 to color in the head, the main outer part of the body, and some of the stripes on the tail, and then I used C5 to fill in the area around the eyes, the belly area, and the stripes that were left on the tail. And then I came in with C7, added a little bit of shading in the areas that I had colored in with C5, and then I used C5 to create some shadowing on the areas that I had colored in with C3. Every time I added shadows, I went back in with a lighter color to make sure that everything was blended nicely. Next I moved on to the owl, and for the owl I used E33, 37, and 39. Just like with the raccoon, I used the two lightest colors, which were E33 and E37, to color in all the owl first, and then I used E37 to create some shadows on the area colored with E33, and I used E39 to create some shadowing on the area that I had colored in with E37. To add a little texture, I did a little bit of a dotted pattern on the darker areas of the owl. Now the bear gave me a little bit of trouble. I started out by coloring the entire body with E11 and the snout with E13, and then adding highlights with the E13 to the area that I had colored with E11. And the more I colored in, the less I liked it, so then I changed my mind and colored the entire bear with E13 and the snout with E15. Well, then at the end of the video, or later on in the video, you'll see that the bear doesn't look like this at all. I would just something about it just seemed wrong, and so I ended up flipping the colors completely and coloring the body of the bear with E15 and the snout with E11, and then adding some highlights with E19. There's nothing wrong with the way this bear turned out. I think it looks good too. I just for some reason didn't think it worked with my composition, so I wouldn't get bogged down on the colors that I use specifically. Just use whatever you have, and depending on your colors, I'm sure it'll look great. To color in the instruments, I did also use Y28, which is listed as Gold Lionette. It doesn't look really gold, but I thought that it was a good color for the instruments. Later on in the video, you'll also see that I added 2 more critters, and I did not film the coloring. I wasn't sure I was going to use them, but I will list the colors on the blog post that I used for the extra critters. Once all my coloring was done, I went ahead and fussy cut all the critters with some really sharp paper snips from Stampin' Up. There are coordinating dies for this set, but I don't have them, and sometimes I just like things to be cut out right along the stamping line, so I'm not sure if I'm going to get them, but it's definitely an option. Once I had my 3 critters cut out, I took a black marker, it's a Stampin' Up! One that has a brush tip, and just went around the edges of all the cutouts just to give them a more finished look when they're on the card. That way, when you look at the card sideways, you won't see all these white edges. They'll just blend right in with the card. I've set my critters aside, and I'm going to start working on the background using the Hero Arts Swirl Stencil. And I think this is a very versatile stencil. You can use it for waves if you're making a card that has fish or mermaids or something like that. But in this case, I'm going to use it to define some hills, some grassy hills. I'm using Distress Oxide inks because they blend beautifully, and first I'm going to take some post-it tape and I'm going to mask off the area of the stencil that I want to use. Then I was going to use Crushed Olive and Mowed Lawn, and I started out with Mowed Lawn and my ink blending tool, and I went ahead and stenciled on the lines, and then I moved on to the Crushed Olive after removing the stencil, and realized that those 2 colors were just not going to work together for me. So I went back to the Mowed Lawn and just used that on top of what I had already stenciled, and because I was using a light touch and the ink wasn't going on as solid as the stenciled lines, everything worked perfectly fine. Then I decided that I would like another mound on the right side of my panel. So I took my stencil one more time and used the post-it tape to section off another area, stenciled it with Mowed Lawn, then removed the stencil and added a little bit more ink over the top of that. I wanted the top portion of the panel to look like it was nighttime, so I started out with Stormy Sky Distress ink. This is a new one to me, and I love this color. And I just very liberally sponged all over the top of the panel. And then I wanted a darker color around the edges of the top. I just thought that Stormy Sky wasn't dark enough, and since I don't have a dark distress ink, a dark blue, I pulled out my Stampin' Up! Night of Navy, and I was hoping that the Distress Oxide being already on the paper would help the Night of Navy blend, and I was right. It just really helped out. It blended great, and I was able to get the night scene I was looking for. So if you don't have that many distress inks, I encourage you to try some of your dye-based inks on top of the distress ink and see if you can get the blend that you're looking for. I'm now moving on to the assembly of the card, and I deviated a little bit from the way the Lawn Fawn videos show you how to do the markings. I put my lines where the opening would be rather than putting them along the scalloped edge, but in the end it doesn't really make a difference. I'd probably recommend that you do it like the Lawn Fawn videos do, which is to mark the scallops, but you will see that in the end it doesn't really make a difference. So essentially what you're doing first is you're making marks that are equally spaced for the number of sentiments that you are using. Since I'm using 4, I needed 4 marks, and so with a ruler running through the middle of the circle, I made 2 marks, and then I turned my ruler 90 degrees and made 2 more marks. Next, I'm taking the 2 circles that I die cut and running a brad through the center holes on both of them. I'm making sure that the circles move freely, and then I'm taking some fairly low profile dimensionals and I'm going to place them on the small circle. I'll remove the liners and then I will line this up with the front panel of my card. The die creates a score line that goes all the way around the scallop circle. The important thing here is to make sure that you cannot see the score line either where you will be turning the circle or through the window. Once you have it perfectly lined up, you will press everything down onto the backing piece that you die cut earlier, and everything will be good and secured to mark where the openings will be. I have picked up a pencil that has a lead that I'm going to be able to erase easily, and I have turned the wheel until I can see the first marking that I have made. I'm going to outline the opening with my pencil and then turn the wheel until I can see my next mark. I will repeat this until I have marked all 4 openings, and then I will remove the scalloped circle so that I can stamp it. I considered using my MISTI to do my stamping, but then I figured it was perfectly fine to do it freehand. Since I had the rectangles, I just needed to line everything up and just stamp it down slowly. And I have a tip for you here. I'm using Memento Tuxedo black ink, which dries very quickly, and that is why I used it. But I stamped it onto the Bristol Smooth cardstock, and as I mentioned before, I didn't start using Bristol Smooth cardstock until a couple of months ago, and I love it for ink blending, but I found that when I stamped with the Tuxedo black ink onto this cardstock, it took a long time to dry. So I actually had to redo my stamping twice, not because it was not lined up, but because I was too impatient and thought the ink should be dry and ended up smearing it. So either give it a long time to dry, or if you're impatient like me, go ahead and use a cardstock that doesn't have a smoother surface. At this point, I have 4 of the 5 critters that I used on the card stamped and colored and cut out. And I also wanted to add the little chick. And since he has such skinny little lines, I didn't want to have to cut those with scissors. So I'm going to stamp it onto my front panel in addition to 2 sentiments from the stamp set. I'm using my Mini MISTI this time because I definitely don't want to mess up my stamping after I've done all my ink blending. I'm using the VersaFine Black Onyx ink again because it stamps a little bit darker than my Memento. And then I'm just going to take all my critters and add a little bit of glue to the back. I'm using Ranger Multi-Matte Medium, and I'm just going to arrange them on the front panel. I'm not using dimensionals because there's so much dimension with the wheel already. I don't want to have an issue when I mail the card. To make sure that my critters lay nice and flat on my card, I am placing in one of my clear acrylic blocks on top of them as I lay them down while I put the glue on the other critter. I thought my panel needed a little something more, so I took some Delicata Golden Glitz ink and stamped a couple of the musical notes randomly all around the panel. I'm finally ready to assemble my card, so I have erased all my pencil lines, and I am now putting the scallop circle back onto the brad with the smaller circle. And I'm going to open the prongs of the brad, making sure that it's not too tight. I added a whole bunch of foam squares. You probably don't need these many, but I really wanted this well supported. It's going overseas, so it's got a long trip, so I added a ton. I then attached the front panel to this and realized that I hadn't die cut the speech bubble that goes around the opening. So I went ahead and did that and made sure that I applied some stick it adhesive onto my cardstock before I die cut it. That way I didn't have to use glue. Since the speech bubble is fairly skinny and I wanted to get it perfectly lined up over the opening, I decided to use my paper piercer to hold it, and then when I had it lined up, I just pressed it down. My front panel was finally totally assembled, so I went ahead and used some 1/2 inch score tape to attach it to my card base, which this may be a little bit of overkill too, but I really wanted to make sure that it stayed put. You know that the receiver and their friends are going to want to play with this and turn the wheel, and you definitely don't want this to fall off the front of the card. To make sure the recipient knows that they're supposed to turn the wheel, I need to cut out an arrow, and I wanted to bring in a little bit more yellow, so I took my Copic marker and colored in a small section of cardstock and then die cut the arrow out of that. I used a small amount of Ranger Multimedia Matte on the back of it to attach it to the card. Finally, I added some finishing touches. I was going to use my glossy accents but couldn't find them, so I took my fine glue tip pen from Stampin' Up! Instead and added some to the instruments, and then I also took a black gel pen and darkened up the eyes of all the critters. So here is the finished card. So easy to make and fun to receive. I highly recommend these dies. I will have all the links to the products on my blog post. Thank you so much for watching and have a great day.